Hello, Greyhounds, and welcome to episode 5 of our NTI book chats, where we're reading How They Choked. Today we're reading about Anne Boleyn, and the title of this chapter is Till Beheading Do Us Part. Henry VIII was the only king in English history to have had 6 wives. It definitely made him the Henry, and he was quite a catch for a nobody like Anne Boleyn. But then again, Henry never met a lady-in-waiting he didn't like. Anne was wife number 2, but even she should have seen the signs. Henry VIII was not marriage material. The guy banished his first wife and pretended the 20-odd years he had spent with her didn't count. He even disowned his own daughter. Anne Boleyn didn't want to see the fine print. In the vow, till death do us part, Henry picks when. But Anne Boleyn thought she could change the guy and also predict the sex of her unborn child. Mostly she was blinded by the crown jewels, but all the golden titles in the world don't make up for a bad choice of a life mate. Rumor has it Anne Boleyn was born in 1501. But it's been confirmed that she was a middle child. She had an older sister and a younger brother, so she needed to go the extra mile to get any attention. The Boleyns qualified for the lowest rung of the 1% of the population that had all the money and power. Anne was smart, good on the lute, and graceful at dancing around in big dresses while trying desperately to get everyone to look at her and not at her big sister Mary. Anne had an external fingernail on one finger. Some people claim she had a whole extra finger. Either way, she liked covering it with a long sleeve. At about 11 years old, Anne got a position in the court of Margaret of Austria, and then eventually moved on to the French court of Queen Claude and King Francis I as a lady-in-waiting, where she met up with her older sister Mary. A lady-in-waiting was trained as a secretary, embroiderer, party girl extraordinaire, and living laugh track for all the Queen's jokes. During 7 years of saying, Je m'appelle Anne, and eating snails and things smothered in mustard, she finally became very French. While Anne conjugated verbs, her sister Mary learned how to French kiss all the men, including King Francis I. Mary was just so darn popular and easy to be with, she eventually had to be thrown out after all the men at court grew tired of her. Anne honed her skills and grew up to be okay to look at if you didn't mind thin lips and enough cute moles to play connect the dots. They say her black eyes did all the talking, and she had the gift of gab that men liked, or you could just call her a flirt. Both Boleyn girls had that unteachable, head-turning something that everybody secretly wished they had: sex appeal. At 20, Anne was reassigned to Henry VIII's court in the employ of his wife, King Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was 36, which back then qualified her as a senior citizen. Her baby-making talents were worn out from her 6 pregnancies, and she had only one living child, Princess Mary, to show for it. Since only men could run England up to that time, Catherine had failed to produce an heir to the throne. It was possible that Henry VIII would be the last of the Tudor clan to live in the royal castles. Even though castles were cold, damp, stinky places, they were hard to give up. Dogs, birds, and even monkeys ran wild and relieved themselves, so did the men, in the layer of rushes that covered the floors. The only carpeted areas were the royal apartments. The people were wild too. It was a generation of slandering, backstabbing, and head removal, and that was between friends. If you think it was romantic, it wasn't. Men wore tights. Henry VIII was 31, and he looked so-so in his royal Spanx. He enjoyed making up laws that worked in his favor, power eating, and spending time with his wife's ladies-in-waiting. Henry's current darling was Anne's sister, Mary. Daddy Boleyn didn't mind Mary's behavior because Henry was promoting him left and right. Anne was sick of being second best. She found herself her own Henry, Henry Percy. He wasn't the king, but he was in line for an earldom. They were secretly engaged, but the wedding never happened. Anne was a nobody, and nobodies weren't allowed to marry somebodies. Anne was furious and was sent away to cool down. Meanwhile, her sister got to stay at court and continue her affair with the king. It was so unfair. About a year later, Anne came back to the queen's household, and by that time Henry had tired of her sister Mary. She had been sent away with no money and no chance of ever marrying into a respectable family. She was ruined. And Henry had decided his next lady-in-waiting with benefits would be Anne, except she was adamantly not interested in a man who had already been with her sister. She had seen the consequences up close. There was too much at stake, and besides, the guy was already married. Not accustomed to being a man in waiting for anything, Henry hounded Anne. She made herself scarce and got out of court as if her life depended on it. Anne's instincts were right, but sometimes he'd go out to find her, or he'd woo her with deer meat. Anne stayed aloof. His love letters arrived often. She barely responded. Nothing would stop him from getting what he wanted. Henry VIII told Anne he would dump Queen Catherine for her, and then he handed Anne some diamonds, rubies, and some really pretty pajamas. Anne became less aloof. He was far from perfect, but she really liked his address. She went back to court to check out the new apartment Henry had prepared for her. It was a good offer for a girl like her, but she wanted more. Actually, she wanted it all. The pajamas, the deer meat, the jewels, but mostly she wanted to be the queen. Queen Catherine figured Anne was just another woman Henry would eventually get tired of like he always did, but not this time. Henry came up with a plan to prove that his marriage to Catherine was illegal because Catherine had originally been married to his older brother, Prince Arthur, until he died 6 months after the wedding. In the eyes of the church, it was illegal to marry your brother's widow, but Catherine swore that her marriage to Henry's brother had never been consummated, and that she had stayed in the family by marrying Henry VIII. If the Pope in Rome believed Henry and declared his first marriage null and void, he'd be a free man. Henry laid out the plan for Anne. Maybe she'd misjudged him after all. Then Anne made Henry a promise that he couldn't refuse, to give him a son. "Make me queen, and you'll see," she said. There was a positive sign when her dad was promoted from Viscount to Lord Privy Seal. She was really showing up, her sister now, and she was going to change Henry into a better man. They waited for the Pope to decide. Besides, being busy surviving the sack of Rome, this Pope had a bad case of indecision. He'd confirm a truce, undo a truce, make an alliance, end an alliance. At least he didn't change his mind after commissioning Michelangelo to paint more of the Sistine Chapel 24 years after he had finished the ceiling. After showering Anne with gifts, Henry popped the question. She said yes to the dress. It was too good to be true, which is usually a sign that it's not. While the Pope was dragging his feet, Henry's advisors tried to change his mind. Downgrading from Catherine of Aragon to Anne of Nowhere was a mistake. Besides the fact that Anne had no political connections like Catherine did to Spain, the people of England thought that Anne was a witch and had put a spell on Henry to make him marry her. And she wasn't acting like a joyful bride-to-be. She demanded all of Catherine's crown jewels and began sending Catherine to smaller and smaller houses with fewer and fewer servants until she ended up living in an empty castle in a deserted town. Anne made Princess Mary, Henry and Catherine's daughter, give up her rights to the throne, and she demanded that Mary hold her train as she walked. Henry was no picnic either. Done waiting for the Pope, Henry made himself the decider, and his first decision was to give himself everything he wanted. Forget the Pope and the Church of Rome. Henry was already king. Now he'd start his own religion, and he'd be his own version of the Pope in England. It took 6 years to pull it off, but Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII got married on January 25th, 1533. It was too bad the people of England hated Anne. Their first initials, H and A, are combined in a showy display that spelled "ha ha," and that's just what people did on her coronation day. They laughed at her. Now it was Anne's turn to give Henry what she had promised, a son. She became pregnant right away. Their birth announcements with the words, "It's a boy," were prepared in advance, But then Anne gave birth to a girl. They called her Princess Elizabeth. The tournament and the fireworks planned by the king were canceled. Anne still wanted to wedge her new daughter ahead of Princess Mary, so Elizabeth would get first pick of the royal princes to marry. Princess Mary got downgraded to Lady Mary, and Anne took all of Lady Mary's jewels and gave them to Princess Elizabeth. After they got married, it didn't take long for Henry to start seeing other women. Wives, even queens, were supposed to look the other way, but not Anne. She told him to quit it and come home on time. She wasn't going to take any of his baloney. Months after Anne was already the queen, the Pope finally made a decision. Henry should go back to Catherine of Aragon at once. Catherine waited for Henry to come get her, but though she got all dressed up, she had nowhere to go. Anne's second pregnancy ended in a stillbirth. The baby was dead. Henry had more affairs with ladies-in-waiting, and whenever Anne knew the woman's identity, she'd banish her from court. At this rate, pretty soon, it would be ladies all gone. Their 2 years of marriage went from better to worse in record time. Henry had turned into a big blob with a nasty personality, and Anne hadn't kept her promise to produce a boy. As the years rolled by, and in between her miscarriage and 2 stillbirths, Anne advocated getting the Bible published in English instead of only in Latin, so people could understand what they were reading. Henry unleashed a reign of terror on churches and monasteries. The priests who didn't acknowledge him as the head of the New English Church were disemboweled, decapitated, or slowly roasted to death. History started to repeat itself on the castle home front. Henry was giving expensive gifts to the lady-in-waiting Jane Seymour, and Anne caught her sitting on his lap. A few days later, Anne miscarried her last baby while Henry worked on getting rid of her, and he took their little daughter Elizabeth out of the order of succession. It was all so familiar. He hadn't changed at all. Anne figured he would send her away to some far-off place like he had done to his first wife. Little did she know, she was in for something much worse. Out of the blue, 5 men were arrested. They were charged with treason and with having intimate relations with the Queen. The 5 innocent men were found guilty and sentenced to death. Anne was brought to trial accused of adultery and conspiring to kill the king, and of laughing at his clothes and making fun of his poetry. She wasn't allowed to have a lawyer. Anne denied the charges. The verdict was guilty. She would be burned or beheaded. Henry VIII would decide. An English queen had never been put to death before. It was unimaginable. On May 19, 1536, a crowd squeezed into the Tower courtyard. Anne wore a dark robe edged in fur with a long white cape. She climbed the scaffold with 4 of her ladies-in-waiting. She gave the headsman some money to ensure he'd do the job in one whack. Before he got to work, Anne Boleyn gave a speech, hoping to save her life, saying that the king was a really great guy. Then she gathered her long hair in a cap so it wouldn't get in the way. She got down on her knees and kept her head on the cap because it was slipping. The headsman had removed his shoes and crept up behind her when she wasn't looking. He circled the sword above his head, and a couple of times, without her seeing it coming, he cut off her head with one swing. Anne Boleyn was dead at 35 years old. After the crowd disappeared, the 4 ladies-in-waiting put the matching pieces of Anne's corpse into a chest and covered them with a sheet. A whole new skill set for ladies-in-waiting to master. Those ladies got a good look at what could happen if you married the wrong person. The very next day, Henry VIII and Jane Seymour were engaged. What was she thinking? Out of Henry VIII's 6 wives, 3 were ladies-in-waiting. One other lady eventually lost her head. It took only 1 generation for Anne's daughter to learn the lesson that marrying the wrong person could kill you and that women could rule England. Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, ruled England on her own for over 44 years with her head safely on her neck. And since Elizabeth never found the right man to marry, she didn't see any reason to bother. Anne Boleyn had taught Elizabeth by grisly example. Thanks for listening in, guys. Check back for episode 6.